To be condemned to death is a terrible fate, but to be condemned to live is a torture beyond imagination. In the early 18th century, a man of profound violence was sentenced to the gallows, but his execution was delayed by the court for over 70 years. He was released on one condition. He must wear the hangman's noose around his neck every single day of his life, a constant physical reminder of his infamy. This is the story of Josiah Blackwood, a man forced to live out his days as a walking ghost, haunted not only by the rope at his throat, but by the phantom he created. In the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a small township carved out of the wilderness, lived a man named Josiah Blackwood. He occupied a cold stone house a mile from the nearest settlement, a house that perfectly reflected the man who built it, morose, violent, and isolated. Blackwood was a man of rough temper and little patience, feared by the few neighbors who had the misfortune of crossing his path. His household consisted of a single servant, a young Scottish woman named Elspeth. In those colonial days, Elspeth was not an employee. She was property. She was an indentured servant, bound to work for Blackwood without pay until the full, crushing debt of her passage from Scotland to the New World was refunded. She was, in every sense but name, his slave. Life in the stone house was a grim existence, punctuated by Blackwood's unpredictable rages. He was a master of the small daily cruelties that grind a soul to dust. For Elspeth, the endless labor was nothing compared to the psychological dread of her master's temper. She lived in a state of constant, quiet terror. One morning, after a particularly brutal verbal assault, Elspeth decided she was weary of the bondage. She could no longer endure the temper, the isolation, or the suffocating presence of Josiah Blackwood. She waited until he rode out to check his traps, and then she ran. She did not get far. When Blackwood returned to an empty, silent house, he did not hesitate. He set off in a raging, immediate chase, his fury mounted. He found her less than 2 miles away, her breath ragged, stumbling through the unforgiving, rocky terrain of the mountain pass. He overtook her, tied her wrists with a length of rope, and fastened the other end to his horse's tail. He then began the slow, humiliating journey back to the stone house. What happened next would become a dark, permanent stain on the county's history. In court, Josiah Blackwood swore to what happened next. He testified under oath that the girl, Elspeth, had stumbled against the horse's legs. The animal, he claimed, was frightened by her fall and rushed off madly, pitching him violently from the saddle. He watched, horrified and helpless, as the horse bolted, dragging the unfortunate servant to her death on the rocks and trees that littered the path. It was, he insisted, a tragic, unavoidable accident. The neighbors and the jury thought otherwise. They knew Josiah Blackwood. They knew his ugly temper, his capacity for sudden, blinding violence. They were far better inclined to believe a different, more sinister version of the story. The prosecution argued that Blackwood, enraged by her escape, had intentionally driven the horse into a gallop. They claimed he had intended to drag the girl for only a short distance as a cruel, terrifying punishment, a lesson in obedience. They argued that in his rage he lost control of the animal, or perhaps in his malice he simply did not rein up in time. The jury, swayed by his reputation and the sheer horror of the act, sided with the neighbors. Based on this supposition, Josiah Blackwood was arrested, tried, and found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to die on the gallows. But Blackwood, despite his morose nature, was a man of influential relatives. Pleas were advanced, favors were called in, and the tricks of circumstantial evidence, his own testimony of being thrown from the horse, the lack of other witnesses, muddied the certainty of his intent. The court, caught between the demands of justice and the influence of a powerful family, rendered one of the most bizarre sentences in colonial history. The execution was delayed. It was ordered that Josiah Blackwood would be released on his own recognizance, but would be executed on his 99th birthday. And in the interim, for the remainder of his natural life, he was ordered to keep a hangman's noose about his neck. This was his badge of infamy. He was a dead man, forced to walk the earth. He was also required to show himself before the judges in the county seat once every year to prove that he still wore the cord and that his crime was kept fresh in his mind. Josiah Blackwood obeyed the sentence. He returned to his stone house, but he was no longer the same man. The morose and violent master was broken. The psychological weight of the rope was more effective than any prison. For decades, he lived as a pariah, a ghost in his own life. People in the settlement, who were still children when the sentence was passed, grew old, remembering him only as the man with the rope. His rough, imperious manner was gone. He was always alone. He seldom spoke. The silken cord, knotted expertly at his throat, became a part of his skin. The only time his silence was broken was when children, innocent of his history, would sometimes ask him what the rope was for. At this, those who saw it said his lips would quiver, his eyes would fill with a terror that had not faded with time, and he would hurry away, clutching the knot at his throat.
His true punishment, however, was not administered by the court, but by the supernatural forces his crime had awakened. After dark, his house was avoided by all. A new folklore, a dark and terrible legend, grew around the stone house and the man who lived inside it. The haunting began. Local gossips said that the shrieking of a woman could be heard passing his house nightly. She was not alone. She was tied, they whispered, to the tail of a giant spectral horse, a horse with fiery eyes and nostrils that flared with smoke. It was the ghost of Elsbeth, forever reliving the final, agonizing moments of her murder. Her screams, a nightly accusation that echoed through the valley.
Blackwood knew of these beliefs. He heard the whispers when he made his rare trips to the settlement for supplies. He heard the stories, but he never grieved, he never scorned, and he never answered when he was told of them. He simply endured, the noose at his neck a constant, tightening reminder. But the haunting was not confined to the road. It invaded his property. It invaded his mind. A curious thing, somewhat like a woman, was seen by travelers sitting on his garden wall. Her form was indistinct, but her fingertips glowed with a pale, cold light like foxfire. She would sit there for hours, staring at his house, sometimes uttering a high, unearthly laugh that sent the travelers running in terror. The animals of the farm joined the chorus of the damned. The cattle would groan, a low, mournful sound, and the dogs would howl beneath his windows, not a howl of warning, but a howl of profound animal reproach. They, too, sensed the darkness that lived with him. Years turned into decades. Each passing year deepened his reserve, his profound, crushing loneliness. He was a prisoner in his own home, besieged by the phantoms of his own rage. Some began to whisper that he would take his own way out of the world, that he would hang himself with the very rope he was forced to wear. But the older folk would shake their heads, repeating the old proverb, "Men who are born to be hanged will never be drowned." Josiah Blackwood was trapped in a purgatory of his own making, a living man condemned to wear the uniform of the dead, waiting for an execution that was still a lifetime away. The world changed around him. The colonies rose up against the crown. A new republic was created. The war for independence swept through the states, bringing with it new laws, new priorities, and new judges. The old colonial court that had passed its strange sentence on Josiah Blackwood was dissolved, its records lost or forgotten in the birth of a new nation. The annual ritual of presenting himself to the judges ceased. There was no one to present himself to.
Finally, the day arrived, Josiah Blackwood's 99th birthday. He was an ancient man, a relic of a forgotten era, the last living link to a colonial crime that had long since passed into dark legend. He waited, but no one came. There were no accusers left to demand his life. There were no judges left to minister the old law. The state, in its violent rebirth, had forgotten him. The executioner never arrived. He lived yet another year, a man who had outlasted his own death sentence. He died in 1801, in his own bed, in his own house, a man who had seemingly escaped the gallows. But the final, terrifying question of his life was answered only after his death. When the neighbors who found his body entered the room, they saw that his long white beard was draped over the rope. From habit, or from a deep internal self-punishment, or perhaps from a binding remorse, he had never taken it off.
When he drew his last breath, alone in the stone house that had been his prison, Josiah Blackwood's throat was still encircled by the hangman's noose. Josiah Blackwood died a free man, his sentence forgotten by the law. But the rope remained. Was it simply a force of habit, the grim routine of a man who had worn his shame for over 70 years until he no longer knew how to live without it? Or was it something more? Did the supernatural forces that haunted his property, the shrieking ghost, the fiery horse, the specter on the wall, refuse to let him go? Did the rope itself, the symbol of his condemnation, become the physical vessel of his curse, a spectral jailer that held him captive long after the human courts had moved on? The state may have forgotten his execution, but perhaps the ghost of Elspeth and the dark justice of the mountains did not. Leave your theories in the comments below. Was the rope a symbol of remorse, or the final supernatural instrument of his execution? Don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Tales Illustrated for more deep dives into the chilling folklore of our land.